My task tonight is to talk to you about some of the principles of classical Christian education, and to do so in light of this year's theme of journey. So to do that, I'd like to draw some parallels between the journey of classical education that you all are guiding your students on right now, and one of the most famous tales of journey that your students encounter during that education, Homer's Odyssey. The Odyssey, of course, tells of the legendary Greek warrior Odysseus and his famous journey from the battle-torn city of Troy to his homeland of Ithaca. While Odysseus has been gone at war, evil suitors have invaded his home and made a habit of devouring all his goods and harassing his wife. They've made a wreck of nearly everything good and beautiful in his home. They're the embodiment of evil in this tale. When Odysseus reaches home, he will be drastically outnumbered, and he will only have a few good men on his side to help him rid his home of the presence of the evil suitors. Luckily for Odysseus, Homer crafts a journey that actually prepares Odysseus to deal with this culminating scenario. Homer puts Odysseus through a long, arduous journey, one that uniquely prepares him for what the poet knows his hero must achieve at the end of this poem. There's some good parallels, I think, between this journey and your own journey of classical education that your family is on right now, as well there should be, because if we're doing things right as classical educators, then the journey that we craft for our students should do much the same thing. It should properly prepare students for the challenges that we know are ahead of them and the destination that we want them to achieve. So that means we have to know what our destination is. Odysseus' destination is his home and his family and his kingdom of Ithaca. What's our analogous destination in classical education? Last year, at this meeting, I shared with you Andrew Kern's definition of classical Christian education, and it's still probably the most effective and concise definition of this, and so I'm using it again. Kern says, Christian classical education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue by nourishing the soul on the true, the good, and the beautiful, by means of the 7 liberal arts, so that in Christ the student is better able to know, glorify, and enjoy God. So that destination is pretty clear. The end goal is that the student would be better able to know, glorify, and enjoy God. And that makes all the difference in our trajectory and in the way that we travel towards that destination. If, like Homer, we're going to prepare our students for that goal, we have to take them along the proper journey. We have to nourish their souls on the true, the good, and the beautiful by means of the 7 liberal arts, thereby cultivating wisdom and virtue. Poor Odysseus has a really hard time nourishing his soul on the true, the good, and the beautiful at first. In fact, he and his men regularly nourish themselves, in the more literal sense, on the wrong kinds of things. On one island, early on in the tale, his men slaughter herds of livestock, killing far more animals than are necessary for what they actually need for sustenance, kind of just because they can. They are depleting the resources recklessly of the people of the island. Not too long afterwards, they discover the lotus eaters who give them the apathy-inducing lotus plant to eat. And they indulge in that, and Odysseus actually has to drag his men back to the ships because they've indulged in this plant and they just zonk out. And even Odysseus indulges when he leads his men right into the cave of the monstrous Cyclops, instead of doing the smart thing and leaving before the Cyclops gets home. He does that because he gives in to greed. He's hoping that whoever lives there will grant him the traditional gift of hospitality. Without any truth or goodness or beauty to guide their lives, Odysseus and his men repeatedly make bad choices. These bad choices culminate on Circe's island, where Odysseus and his men receive refreshment and rest from their journey. But instead of leaving after a few days of rest to continue the journey, Odysseus completely loses sight of his destination. He stays on the island for a full year, feasting and indulging. It's a pretty accurate picture of what human beings are. We don't naturally desire or cultivate wisdom and virtue and thereby know, glorify, and enjoy God. We're selfish, sinful creatures. We need Christ, and then we need our loves to be ordered by repeated exposure to truth, goodness, and beauty, and by mastery and exercise of the liberal arts if we're going to attain wisdom and virtue. For starters, I think Odysseus could really use a grammar stage education with its order and routine and memory work so that he can have some idea of what it means to act well instead of badly. Interestingly, when Odysseus finally decides to take his journey back up again, Circe immediately sends him to Hades. Now, it might seem like an odd choice on Homer's part, but remember that Odysseus' world is pre-literate, So he can't, just waltz down to his local library and check out anthologies on the best poetry and philosophy. So to put him in contact with the best of his culture's thought, Homer has to send him to the underworld, where the most famous figures of history and legend reside. This is where Odysseus receives what classical educator Eva Brand calls his true schooling. She says he comes back laden with the stuff of poetry, the tales of the dead. This is Odysseus' logic stage education, really. He encounters the seer Tiresias, who explains to him that he will never make it home unless he starts practicing and exhibiting virtue, specifically self-restraint, and keeping his home at the forefront of his view. He talks to his mom, who, not surprisingly, imparts some important knowledge to him and admonishes him to remember what he learns in this education. Additionally, Homer parades a whole host of ghosts from Greek myth and legend before Odysseus, cataloging the poetic tradition that Odysseus is getting to experience in this education. And the adventurer student also talks to warriors from Troy like Achilles and Agamemnon. They warn him about the world, and they remind him what it means to be a warrior and a hero in an existence filled with pitfalls. After such an education, Odysseus is much more equipped to deal with what lies ahead. How much more equipped are your own students for what lies ahead after a Christian classical education? After all, Odysseus' paragons of virtue are those of the ancient pre-Christian Greeks, and his idea of truth falls drastically short of scriptural revelation. The catalog that your students get to nurse themselves on is so much more beautiful and robust. They learn not only from Homer, but from those of later antiquity like Socrates and Plato and Virgil. They learn, of course, from Christ and from Paul and from Augustine. They learn from Dante and Chaucer, Shakespeare and Luther, Locke and Burke, Washington and Madison, Chesterton and Lewis, just to name a few. In parading these authors and historical figures and their stories before your students year after year, we hope to achieve the same kind of education that Homer gives Odysseus. We want to teach your students what virtue looks like so that they can learn to love it and yearn for it in their own lives. We want to show them examples of wisdom so that they can begin to be wise themselves. We hope to warn them about the world before they find themselves independent and immersed in a culture that will try its best to turn them away from truth. And we want to teach them how to heroically cling to that truth when that happens. Eva Brand also notes that even though Odysseus lives in a pre-literate society, he's pretty well versed in the liberal arts because he shows that he's able to observe and interpret his world and experiences. Much of the Odyssey, after all, is told in Odysseus' own words as he recalls his journey and realizes its meaning and significance. The liberal arts, and especially the first three, that trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, are the tools for doing just that. They allow your students to observe and absorb, digest and process, and then interpret and describe meaning and significance. So after this preliminary education in the liberal arts, Homer still doesn't end Odysseus' journey. Instead, he puts Odysseus through a rigorous training in which this adventurer student must actually exercise those liberal arts by applying them to a series of further adventures. We might think of this as the rhetoric stage of Odysseus' education. He has many of the tools he needs, but now he's getting practice at applying them before he graduates to face the challenges that await him on Ithaca. Odysseus is warned that the sirens, for example, will tempt him through their enchanting songs. They make sailors forget their home and dive overboard. So Odysseus plugs up his men's ears with wax and then ties himself to the mast of his ship so that he can listen to the sirens without being overcome by their song. It's a brilliant little application of logic stage cleverness because he manages to get the knowledge of the sirens without coming under their enchantment. Likewise, he applies discernment when he realizes that as much as he really longs to be a heroic warrior, some monsters are too big and too evil for him to fight alone. He realizes that the six-headed monster Scylla is an evil that he simply needs to flee, and so he orders his crew to row past her as fast as they can. And when he and his men find themselves hungry and stranded on the island of the sun god, Odysseus remembers that he had received a warning to not eat the sun god's cattle. And so he goes up on the mountain to fast and pray instead of giving in to the temptation to eat the cattle, like his men do. As a result of all this application, when Odysseus washes up on the island of Calypso, who wants him to forget his home and stay on the island with her, He resists the temptation to give up and give in for 7 years. Later he comes to the island of the Phaeacians and he receives a similar offer from their king. Stay, settle down, marry the Phaeacian princess. How tempting in both of these cases, after nearly 20 years away from home at this point, to give up. How tempting to forget about his home and his wife Penelope and just settle down into the shiny new life that's being handed to him on a silver platter. But by the time he's with the Phaeacians, towards the end of his journey, Odysseus is able to say no pretty much without a second thought. He is so focused on his destination that he can't even conceive of accepting any of these offers. That's what the last stage of a classical education is really for at its heart. It's for applying those core principles again and again until they become second nature. Your students dig through very meaty material, interpret its meaning, and express truth over and over again so that when the real challenges come, they can face them with confidence. Because like Odysseus, after this practice, your students are going to graduate to Ithaca, and they're going to have to face the suitors. It's hard work to read Augustine's Confessions and interpret its meaning and express its truth and then apply those truths to your life. But engaging an atheistic dorm mate or a hostile coworker with truth and in love, I think, is even harder. We want your students to practice now. Practice wrestling with truth and goodness and beauty and their opposites so that they're prepared for what lies ahead. Like Odysseus, your students are going to be outnumbered in a culture that is increasingly hostile to their beliefs. And like Odysseus, they will have to eventually show the world who they are by pushing back against evil. Odysseus is successful in ridding his home of the evil suitors and in bringing peace and order to his land. And it takes every ounce of cleverness and discernment and self-restraint and courage that he's built up along the way to be able to do that. God willing, at the end of a classical education, your students will be prepared to do the same in whatever context God decides to put them in during their lives ahead. We none of us know what each of your students' Ithacas will be, but they will have them, and they need to be prepared. To use the words of Granite's mission statement, we want to help your students become godly, powerful, and redemptive agents of change in a fallen world. We want them to have discernment and understanding, clear and critical thinking, graceful and persuasive speech, and a redemptive worldview. We desire for these children to evaluate their entire range of experience in the light of the scriptures, and to do so with eagerness in joyful submission to God. Your children were created to know, glorify, and enjoy God. That's their home. When your students graduate and joyfully submit to whatever God's calling is for their lives, there will be challenges. They need to know how to keep their home in view and boldly face whatever evil looms ahead. These formative years for which you are the primary educators of your children is the time to prepare them for those challenges. And we at Granite look forward to helping you guide them on that journey for another year.